So what I'd like to do is I'd ask Adam to kick us off with his thoughts on the what is a very complex and multifaceted area when you talk about supply chain risk management, with a lot of different aspects to it. Everything from protection of program information, anti-tamper, you know, the chips that we're using, are they secure, et cetera, as well as what we've talked about a lot today, weapons system security. And then I'll pose a couple of questions to our panel here and get them started. So Adam, if you'd kick us off, please.
Thanks for that. So first of all, I want to thank AUSA for throwing these. We do a couple of these at the executive level, and you sort of know when you sort of fit into the team when General Crawford stands up in front of a group of executives sitting next to General Fogarty and says, this supply chain risk management problem is really a really hard problem for me, and the guy you got to talk to is Adam Nucci. So that's how this all started. So thank you very much for this. This is a fabulous forum. I really appreciate AUSA doing these. So I'll start there. I also want to make sure that I make it absolutely clear I am definitely not the smartest and deepest on the panel in several areas, and I'm going to lean very heavily on the team here to try to help out. But what I'm going to really spend some time doing is just framing the front end of this. We just recently had to take this topic to Army senior leadership, and I kind of started in a specific place. This supply chain risk management thing is not new. I started in the government in 1990. I was design engineer, and we did supply chain risk management then. It looked very different, though. We're in this data-driven world today, and what happens in industry is far different. So let me start with a little bit of the Wayback Machine. In 1990 to 2000, were we watching our supply chain when things shift from a prime to the government? And the answer is yes. We GPS tracked every truck that went with a weapon on it to a submarine. And many other pieces that were for the Army and were for the Air Force. Did we build a lot of things that were made in the U.S.? The answer is yes. And then we globalized, and now this is now an undeniable team sport between industry and academia and the government. So from my perspective, we all sort of learned to be risk managers. And, but I think one of the things that I experience on a very regular basis is the real question is, do we mitigate those risks? So there's a fairly well-structured way that industry does this. And I've sort of adopted this within the Army team. And that is, as you understand your risk environment, you eventually have to make 4 decisions, and I call them the 4 T's. What we mostly do is we tolerate that risk. The second thing we could probably do is transfer that risk. Now, industry is very good at this. They transfer risk between business areas. Eventually, you might have to actually terminate a program or stop something you're doing. In the supply chain risk management, that means you might find a supplier, maybe he's not the right one, you're going to terminate that relationship. Hopefully there's enough others, because we do things very, time critical. And then finally, the one that's the hardest to do and the one we technically don't usually do, and that is that we actually treat the risk and we actually mitigate the problems. What's kind of a challenge in supply chain risk management right now is this is very important to the Army, it's very important to the department. And so we're currently right now on a 180-day sprint to do a couple of things. I've been given sort of 3 hard tasks by G3 of the Army. The first is to get organized. Now, why is that important? Well, because in the Army, there's some things that you know when the Army does something well. How do you know when the Army does something well? Well, there's usually an Army regulation and there's usually an Army field manual. So in the area of supply chain management, AMC does that as one of their core competencies. But supply chain risk management, there's actually an Army regulation for that. And it's been around, was recently redone in late 2018. And it really casts a very strong partnership between the G3 of the Army for prioritization and what things become the most important and how those decisions get made. The CIOG6 of the Army, but most importantly, ASALT, right? The acquisition community. And so So really, when you look at the risk management spectrum, we kind of break it into three big chunks. And so I'll try and talk in threes. The one that's the most mature is program management. So we have a program protection program, and in acquisition, we have solidified contract language. We've worked on things within the acquisition community. We work with industry to understand the spectrum of the supply chain. That's only one piece of it. The other thing the Army spends a lot of time and energy doing, if I had a G2 rep here, we'd talk about that, is technology protection. So we usually take a system and we get down to the technology layer, and then we understand where it's being built in academia, maybe with one of our foreign partners, or with industry, and then we put a lot of energy on making sure that if that's a critical component, that we sort of are trying to understand that risk environment. The one we spend the least time doing, and where I have my energy is really kind of around a big idea. So here's the big idea. If you're a soldier or you're a commander, and I roll a piece of equipment to you, or AMC ships something to you, what's your presumption? What should your presumption be? Your presumption should be it is uncompromised. It comes out and it works. And that's an interesting thing, because if we're going to have advantage on the battlefield, you know, if you go to command senior leader courses and you talk to battalion commanders, or like I'm going to go to Cyber Blitz a couple of nights from now in the overnight when we're working with Orient Shield, that thing shows up and it's supposed to be uncompromised. Now, what happens if it's not? Okay, so Air Force and the Army has dealt with a couple of cases where it's not. And what does that look like? Okay, because our vision on this, we tend to get down into the details. And what I'm trying to achieve is a place where I don't have to ground helicopters. What happens if I have something and it's a supply chain problem and I ground a helicopter? It turns out it looks like it's a reliability issue, but how do you know the difference? So what does the Army do about that? We actually pick up a team, we fly that team to the flight line, and then they triage the problem, and then eventually they find out what it was, and then we might put the helicopters back into service. How long does that take? Okay, you'd like it to not be a month. You'd like it to be weeks. You'd like it to be days. Here's the challenge question. How do I make it hours and minutes so that I can actually deal with that the flight line can handle that problem, that the system tells the operator the difference between a reliability problem and something that's cyber? We're not there yet. So that's an idea. Now, so between the three types of protection, technology, programs, and capability, the Army has an unbelievable amount of terrain. So let's now make this an IT discussion. So what we tend to do is we have three different communities that are really working to handle this supply chain risk. One is the commodity IT environment, right? These are our networks, our enterprise networks. We're spending a lot of time and energy on those. The second one is weapon systems, and in weapon systems I also include tactical communications. But then the third one, and I'm purposely breaking them up this way, is critical infrastructure. Now, let's talk numbers. We heard today that on the IT environment, 1.2 million endpoints. I think I can quote the boss saying that. We can argue about the actual number, okay? A lot. Weapon systems. The priority set of them is about 140 to 150 of them. All right, now G3 of the Army. How do I get to that number? Okay, we heard today about long-range precision fires. So you have to be willing to prioritize. So let's talk about Army modernization. I have a diagram, wish I had it up on the board for you. The Army is modernizing the network, okay? And that network is going to be a time-critical warfighting platform that's going to help us do two other time-critical missions, long-range precision fires and integrated air and missile defense. If I take those, I'm tying those together with STI, I'm putting sensors on soldiers and soldier lethality, and I'm going to need the space layer to make all that work. That top tier of things are the areas where the weapon systems where we have to do the most stringent job of supply chain risk management live. It's not just about long-range precision fires. From the G3's perspective, it's that larger piece. If we get those right, then the robotics I'm putting into next-gen ground combat and the things I'm putting into advanced vertical lift will all seamlessly work together. And that's the way the G3 has been sort of thinking through how do I identify the things where I really have to do supply chain risk management very, very well. Priorities, framework. Okay. So now, I like to use examples because it's hard sometimes to take this thing we call supply chain risk management and make it tangible. We talked about the people problem. Here's the way I think about the people problem with supply chain risk. We have this acquisition community that's working really, really hard, and then the Army fields equipment. So we push it into sustainment. What happens when we push it into sustainment? The logistics community, AMC, how I ship stuff gets to places, and the problem changes. Now, Walt Disney, a long time ago, decided they were going to revitalize how Disney does business. And what they essentially decided was everybody at Disney is a cast member. Right? It used to be about the characters and meeting Mickey, and they eventually started retraining everybody, so it didn't matter whether you talked to the guy sweeping the street, the person running the ride, the person at the ticket booth, or Mickey, everybody was a cast member. One of this people problem across the Army is going to be, I think, one of the really big challenges that we're going to have to deal with to get supply chain risk management right. But to quote Charlie Flynn, this is a time of, now everybody fill in the answer. Like I'd even love you to write it down. If you're a downside person, you say this is a time of challenge. We've heard of lots of challenges. We believe this is a time of opportunity. The Army's going to transform in this direction, and this time of opportunity is a place where these big data solutions we've talked about, the partnership with industry we've talked about, all become opportunities for us to really get after this one. And I'll stop there.
Great. Thanks for teeing that up, Adam. And so based on Adam's introductory remarks, for each of our industry reps on the panel, I'd ask each of you to describe what your companies are doing with respect to ensuring the supply chain, highlight the challenges therein and/or best practices, as well as how you get visibility in those lower tiers in the supply chain. And I'd ask ManTech, Quantum, and Microsoft to respond in sequence. And if you would, introduce yourself as well.
Okay, thanks. Andy Twomey, I'm with ManTech. I run their defense business unit, so anything within the DoD, the services is within my portfolio. Across the company, we do cyber work both in DoD and in the intelligence community and with NSA. Was in the Army for 31 years. Infantryman, somehow learned how electrons moved around and money moved around later in life. Look, let me leverage off of Adam's opening and comment on a couple of things, and answer Greg's question about give you some highlights on what we're doing. Sort of a start point here in this discussion of supply chain risk management is particularly with regard to both software, the IT environment and the weapon system environment, software in weapon systems. Even if we turned the clock back 20 years and did everything perfectly, we would still have significant problems to be dealt with. One of those that I would highlight that sometimes doesn't come to the front of your mind with regard to supply chain risk management is that of insider threat. You have, and one of the things that the company, that ManTech has had to do because of our work, both with the intelligence community and the DoD, is have a very robust insider threat program. Monitoring of our employees, their behaviors, and behavioral analysis to be able to get in front of that. By the way, that we've sort of reached the point in industry where other companies have come to us and said, help us run an insider threat program. At some point, an issue that everyone in industry and government will have to deal with is for these very sensitive systems, even if it's an unclassified system, you are going to have to monitor your workforce and have both the positive, a security culture in your workforce, but also the monitoring mechanism to say, I have this workforce and I'm pretty confident, I'm highly confident that I'm delivering the right things at the right time and the people are performing correctly. Let me talk to you a little bit. Adam made a great point. You want to sort of assume that stuff works, right? You want to assume that it gets delivered and that stuff is going to work. And let me just give an example within the weapon system environment of some of the challenges. We happen to work for, I'll use a Navy example. I'd like to keep seeding the joint examples. We happen to support the Navy on the P-8 anti-submarine warfare platform in terms of integration. Lots of, without going into a lot of things, lots of computer processing power of things coming in, data coming in from sensors sitting on that aircraft. Lots of software that needs to be updated, upgraded on a periodic basis. Keeping up with the pace of change and making sure that those things are coming in with quality was occupying an update comes in, the desire of the customer to run testing on that piece to make sure that it was in fact what they wanted to do. 3-month period just to set up test environment. So how do you shorten that? Well, you shorten that by creating a simulated, call it a cyber range environment, an environment where you can put the hardware in the loop, you can bombard it with whatever virus or whatever attack that you want to test it against, and you can, you shorten just your test setup time from being measured in weeks and months to being measured in hours, maybe days, right? So you take that time out of the loop. But more importantly, you get a higher level of confidence that when you integrate this thing, it's going to work. And you put it up on the airplane, it's going to work. I would offer for consideration that even if you do everything perfect, you pick the perfect supplier, they follow the perfect procedures, you write the contract right, there are some systems where you are going to want to have these sort of testing environments, and the speed of change means that you have to get to this speedy environment. You can't live with month and month updates. The updates are going to come too fast and too furious, and you've got to be able to. So to really have confidence in what's being delivered, you're going to have to deal with cyber testing and cyber hardening in creating those environments. I'd offer just another thought, particularly as Adam defined it in the IT environment. Again, it's this thought, even if I do everything sort of perfect at the back end and write the greatest contracts in the world, stuff's going to sneak through. One of the techniques that we see lots of people talking about, and that in fact, this morning General Nakasone mentioned the PCTE program. We're one of the folks providing services to PEO STRI in terms of the development of that particular program. Going to be a globally distributed environment, training environment. That is being built on a concept of a zero trust, using container technology and microservices through a service mesh, open source, commercial type software, in order to create an environment where you can plug and play. You can put in this piece of software because our cyber has decided this new XYZ software is the greatest training thing since sliced bread. You're going to want to bring it into that training environment. You're going to want to bring that new tool in. And how do you do that fast? How do you do that to be able to respond? The industry sort of technique for that is containers, service mesh, zero trust. And if and you should, I would recommend everybody that, I'm not selling some secret sauce here. If you're not speaking that language, my sense is you should, the industry-wide, you need to kind of get there pretty quickly, because that's really what DoD is going to end up demanding. So I think I probably exhausted my time. Maybe, hopefully I set some thoughts out there for people to react to. Thanks.
Hey, thanks, Andy. Over to you, Tim.
Tim Bloechl. I'm going to kind of twist the question a little bit and literally take cyber supply chain and think through some of the problems we're facing. I work for small, medium-sized business, depending on what the NAICS codes are, and we do an awful lot of work in cybersecurity services and those kinds of things, a lot of experience with computer emergency response teams and risk management framework. And we build some things too. There's a lot of software development, but largely it's people helping in many, many different contexts. And lately, in the last year or two, we've been very focused on security, not only of our company, but of our customers. And so I have both commercial customers and we have a growing number of defense customers. And there's a couple different ways to look at the problem here. One can be, the widgets, the hardware, the software that goes into these systems we're developing. Certainly you have to look at that. When I was in OSD back decades ago now, baking cyber in and not brushing it on afterward was very important. I'm not sure we're doing that well even today. But now I think in terms of the companies that we deal with, the partners. So listed on your industry partners as part of the question. You know, we deal as a prime, we deal as a sub. It all depends on what the contract is we're going after, who has the best capabilities, who's the best to lead. And we have a growing problem. There are a number of requirements now that we have to meet, regardless of the relationship as defense industry companies in the cyber realm. A couple years ago, DFARS changed and the requirements were placed on us to apply NIST standards to what we were doing. And then there's the next step, which I'm going to talk about in a second, the cybersecurity maturity model certification that's popping up. One set of requirements followed by another. Most companies, small, medium-sized business, suppose there's about 300,000 defense contractors out there. Most companies fall into the small and medium-sized business category. Many of these companies have small IT shops or they outsource their IT to others. And depending on what the service level agreements are, who knows how good the security is for those companies. We all know we're under a cyber threat. Back in 2005, I led an interagency task force focused on the Chinese threat, infiltrations into DoD. At that time, we were focused more on how are they getting in, what are their techniques, because they were very stealthy. Now I think we're focused more on the risk management side based on the amount of dollars, the intellectual property that's being stolen. I heard one figure the other day, 600 billion. That's coming out of the Pentagon. I'm not sure how they came up with that number. Sounds too even for me as a former intelligence officer, but it's a number. I think we can all agree they're taking a lot, and they're doing it more and more. So now when you take a look at the situation where you have maybe 5 or 6 companies that are teaming together to go after a contract, you're starting to think of things you didn't think about before. How good does that partner of mine secure their data? What is their network like? How do they secure government information? Do they comply now with these NIST standards under the DFARS? And when you look at it, there's 14 families of controls, security controls, 109 total. And if you printed out the document, all that information, it's about this high. It's about a foot high. And then I think back to that small company with maybe 1 or 2 IT people And I go, how in the world are they going to deal with this? Fast forward to today, CMMC, requirement for defense contractors, defense companies to achieve certain levels of cybersecurity maturity in order to compete on contracts. And when I look at the numbers again, now we've grown from 14 families to 18 domains. We've gone from 109 security controls up to 241 what they call practices, levels 1 through 3. And if you're really into deep technology, high risk, weapon systems, capabilities that are critical to national defense, and you have to achieve a CMMC level 4 or 5, you're looking at 370 total things that you have to achieve in order to qualify to be able to compete on those contracts. And some of these things are hard, and they cost a lot of money. Now, I'm not saying it's not right. Having lived in the intelligence world and focused on this threat back when there was a Joint Task Force Computer Network Defense before Cybercom, I know it's bad, and we really need to do this. But the challenge is going to be, first, how can you team properly and understand what your partners are doing? How do you achieve those levels of requirement in order to compete? What are the costs involved? For some of these companies, I think that number of 300,000 is going to get smaller because they're not going to want to compete. They're not going to be able to afford to do the things necessary to achieve some of these levels. And for others, it's going to be a big hit on their budgets on an annual basis, or they're going to have to outsource it. So supply chain risk now, looking at from a cyber perspective and a company perspective, industry's perspective, is becoming even more difficult. And it's going to be a challenge now for us to achieve these levels of requirements here, these competencies that are required. So that to me is the thing that bothers me the most, that I know we're dealing with as a company, and we're fortunate that we have some pretty good cyber people and can do that, but a lot of companies don't.
Hey, great, thanks.
Mr. Nucci's opening comments that are more inherent to the way we as a big software company think about these things. Number one is we have a fundamental rule that we never assume anything is non-compromised. We assume breach. From the point that the first line of code is written, the thing has already been hacked. We start from there. And I think that's an important cultural shift that's necessary to be made, to start to understand that the risk to the supply chain actually starts at design. It doesn't start once you've got a thing you're trying to figure out how to deliver at scale. This second point really is just that. It's just that supply chain in the cyber realm is a huge part of a multi-domain operation. The cyber fight is ongoing. It's already started. We're just now starting to acknowledge that it's happening, but we've been fighting on this front for quite a while. The constituent ingredients that our critical infrastructure, our IT commodity systems, and our weapons are made out of are already been subject to attack and are probably vulnerable. And if we don't assume that they are, we're making a huge mistake there. So Microsoft is grown up as a software company. Over the last few years, we've had a pretty fundamental change in our business where we have become a cloud-first company that also sells some first-party hardware. So internally, this has had a huge impact on how we view supply chain. For the first 30 years of the company's existence, supply chain was hiring outside developers. It was just bringing in more talent because we couldn't hire enough people. Here recently, we've had to start to understand supply chain in a different way as we spec and buy hardware to build regulated clouds, as we deliver night vision goggles to the United States Army, as we build and sell laptops and tablets and these types of things. So as we've gone down this path, we did a little bit of analysis, and in 2014, Microsoft's internal supply chain team was generating 1 terabyte of data a day that was being used to do nothing but generate 2 static reports that were looked at weekly. So I don't think this is inherently all that different to the Army's problem, right? None of us have a problem with the amount of data. We have a problem with how we figure out how to do anything with it, how to make actionable insight out of the data we've got. So the prescription, the lesson learned from this endeavor for us, it was called Expedition Cloud. We produced a bunch of videos on it if anybody's interested in watching them. They're kind of fascinating. But the prescription is three-phased. Number one, you've heard this a lot already today, is to make it a risk-based approach. You're going to have to accept a little bit of risk. You can't be so risk-averse that you totally stifle innovation. And you also just have to be comfortable with mitigation and not elimination. So along this line, quantifying risk becomes really important. The risk comes in three phases. It's people, it's process, and technology. You've heard this from a lot of people today as well, but I think the process is one that's often overlooked. We talk a lot about insider threat. We talk a lot about cyber vulnerability. What we don't think a whole lot about is how the process by which we build, develop, deploy, integrate, and feedback on that has its own level of vulnerability for injection of threat. So that's a place where I think some attention should be focused. The second prescription is to ensure transparency in the supply chain, and this is bi-directional. You have to not only expect insight into the business processes and development practices of your suppliers, you have to be clear about what threat vectors you're tracking. You also have to be clear about what the reverse risk and expectation is. This transparency facilitates feedback. It's not all about oversight. If it were only you looking at your supplier, then we'd call it oversight. The transparency scenario really matters in that sometimes you just need to make your suppliers aware of what the problems are. You have to figure out how to accurately communicate what the threat vector is, what the thing you're worried about is, so they can build appropriately to mitigate that particular risk. And I think the third one is flexibility. There's no great single formula for buying all things. I mean, the Army buys everything from beans to classified clouds. So you have to understand that you can't apply a singular prescription that will make a supply chain not vulnerable in all cases of acquisition.
Hey, great points. Thanks, Mick. So we've talked a lot today about the network and the importance of the network to enable everything that the Army's trying to do. And so we're fortunate to have Nancy Kreidler here today from the CIOG6. And Nancy, I'd like you to talk a little bit about the enterprise IT network, because Adam talked about that as a subset of supply chain risk management, and what you're doing to secure the enterprise IT network, as well as some of the challenges therein.
Okay, thank you. So I'm the new cybersecurity director at CIOG6. I am responsible for all cybersecurity policy that you all hate. I am also responsible for the risk management framework, which you all hate. But I liked this morning when we talked about, I think Leo talked about zero trust, going to zero trust. But he said, you know, we're still in this castle and moat idea, kind of where we are. And you know, I'm still in the castle. I'm guarding the castle because we still have a castle and moat. And until you can close up the castle, you still have to look after the state that you're in. So my job kind of pulls me in two directions. I see the future of securing data and zero trust and where we need to go, DevSecOps, making things more secure. However, there's a right now that we have to worry about. So I still have to worry about, you know, is PII, you know, is privacy protected? Is the data encrypted? Are we using PKI and things like that? So that continues to be ongoing. The common thread in all of it is what is the security architecture we're using to assess risk? And so DoD has levied RMF on us, risk management framework, whether we like it or not. And so I see part of this job is trying to make that work for us. I know one of the things you talked about was all the controls, and what you didn't say about the controls, even though there's 300 controls, each of those controls have common controls underneath them. So we're looking at 14 to 1,900 controls. And when you have so many controls, no controls are important. And so we're looking to continue to streamline that process. And certainly streamline it for impending technologies that are coming, AI and you know, machine learning and things like that. So the job is kind of twofold. You know, it's the here and now, and it's where we're going in the future. That said, when we talk about supply chain risk management, it has been around for a long time. I'm coming from the acquisition world, so this was part of our program protection plan. But when you look at enterprise, our enterprise, 1.2 million endpoints, and those are the ones that we're counting, that's not all of them, you could really have an effect at scale at DoD through hardware and software on our enterprise. And so when you think about desktop and laptops and mobile devices and printers, scanners, our cross-domain solutions, all of that is up for grabs. And so I just want to walk through the questions that for every piece of equipment and software that runs on all this hardware, what are the parts? Who is the vendor? Who makes it? Where is it made? Who really makes it? What is the origin of the piece part? How do they make it? And what are the risks, and this is important, during design, development, manufacturing, distribution, and sustainment? And we're supposed to be asking that for everything that we buy. So think about it when you go to the cube with the person that holds the credit card and say, hey, go buy me a printer. And so the enterprise IT is really something that we need to look after. And it's also like cybersecurity, supply chain. You cannot bolt it on at the end. It's too late. You have to bake it in. And so when we look at people and we look at workforce, I think General Crawford said, if you're a contracting person, but you can also write about cloud, we have to have supply chain risk management as part of everybody's job, cross-cutting across everything that we do. So those questions that I asked are the process of illumination, and that is to illuminate the supply chain from beginning to end. And the most important part of that is still sustainment, because you can get through that whole process and come out clean, but what happens when there's an update? And you're still vulnerable at that point. So the Army, with the structure, the governance that led by, G357, co-chaired by ASALT, is really the way the Army's starting to get after this. And we're in a lockstep with DoD. But I think we're going to start looking at tools and analytics to look after these. Commercial industry supplies information about these products where you can start looking at devices, software, hardware that can go down all these levels until you get the most bottom level to say where these things are made and where they come from. And so, the idea is to deliver uncompromised, but it's also to maintain uncompromised. One of the things I think in culture that we can do is, as we start to talk about supply chain, start to talk about it like privacy, because people get privacy, because it applies to every single one of us. But for supply chain, think about your vote being delivered uncompromised, or your bank transaction being delivered uncompromised, or an order out in the field in operations being delivered uncompromised. And so that's where we're looking. But enterprise is certainly, it's the bang for the buck if you want it.
Hey, thanks very much, Nancy. This next question is for the panel, and I'll start with Adam and Nancy, and then anybody else can chime in. So one mechanism the Army has used previously to reduce risk is insourcing. Things like software development, for instance. Is this a viable and sustainable course of action for the Army? Insourcing.
Is that a viable for the Army? Okay, great question. I've been quoted numerous times, and I feel very strongly about this. There's no way to meet the demand if you're going to insource everything to the Army. There's just no way to do it. I will also tell you that my market research says that there are these centers of excellence in industry out there that are really worthy of leverage, as is the move to DevSecOps. I mean, the whole idea of insourcing, my view, okay, just my view, engineer, is that it has its place. I think there will be places where, potentially for very sensitive things, where maybe it makes sense to have a stronger balance. But I don't think that will actually work for the Army.
Anybody?
I mean, DevSecOps is going to bring some, more security than we have now. Maybe not in the framework that you're speaking about, maybe not necessarily with supply chain. I mean, DevSecOps is a great thing, and we need to institute this in the future. It's also the way you're going to get to continuous monitoring or continuous ATO. The thought that we have life cycle processes where cybersecurity is not built in is not the way we should go, right? So 20 years ago, we had the software engineering life cycle, and we didn't have security built into that because we didn't have security problems like this. But now when you go to school, that's part of it, and so it's got to be part of our development process. But with regard to supply chain risk management, I'm not sure that that's the solution. I agree.
I would extend this question even further. I very much appreciate the changes I've seen in the Army's willingness to participate with industry partners in doing code with scenarios. The insourcing things are great. I think it's critical to how you get to something like DevSecOps, where we have some transparency between us, where we all understand how to continuously develop and continuously field these really critical solutions. I think not only is insourcing not going to work, I think indigenous innovation will also not work. In a near-peer scenario, they are going to use the best algorithm, the best weapon they can find, regardless of who wrote it. So we have to come up with scenarios where we can develop using tools that we may not inherently trust. Not only can we not write all the code, we can't even count on all the code being written by the Defense Industrial Base, unless we just want to get behind.
Okay, great, thanks.
And I'd like to
Good.
make a point. And I think the way the software and the IT industry has gone in the last 20 years, you're seeing a exponential growth in capabilities that weren't there before, the Internet of Things, the move to the cloud, the mobile environment, the things that today's soldiers expect to see and may not. They're going to want it. That move and that innovation and the fact that the IT industry largely is moving forward as fast as they can to pump out these new products and capabilities that on the one hand may be very good for us and improve how we operate. On the other hand, the cyber side, I don't think it can keep up. And to insource that then, I think is almost impossible to do that kind of work. I think somehow we have to find a way, maybe it's RMF, maybe it's these other security controls and the different assessments that we do to find these vulnerabilities on the front end before they're deployed. I think that's kind of critical. I know I led Microsoft's global defense business for 6 years, and the gold disk that we used back then, which we may still be using it's gone, yeah. The gold disk we used back then, though, was the thing to make sure that all the computers that were deployed into the Army had that one standard to begin with. So at least you had a fighting chance on the front end to avoid a potential hack within the first 20 minutes that you turn on a machine. So I think the insourcing question is a great question. I think it's dead.
I think we beat that horse enough. The horse is now dead. So, Adam, in your opening comments, you talked about a shared responsibility between industry, academia, and government to get after the issues associated with supply chain. How would you best bring those three groups together to start to address the issues that we're talking about here today? And then anybody else can jump on the grenade after Adam.
So, to be honest, he teed this question up last week, and I've been trying to think of the actually eloquent, dastardly, beautiful answer for the room. And quite frankly, I don't think there is one. I'm a fan of this being a constant relationship through the life cycle of everything we build. I'll tell you that I believe that the supply chain we manage is so dynamic that relationships, data sharing, both ways between the government and industry on what we know about vectors and what we know about the supply chain, being willing to go deep together into the deeper parts of the supply chain and manage this dynamically throughout the life cycle is something that that partnership should start at the inception of a program and not just be a relationship between the PM giving requirements and the design team giving requirements. We have to open up the door to private-public partnerships in some of these cases. And there's not one size that fits all. That's just my perspective. And part of the reason is that I've done supply chain risk management analysis before, and to the point, I get a book this thick that's as old the day it hit my desk as it is detailed. What that means is that we need to change the model for how the three work together on a regular basis, from the beginning of concept development all the way through how that incubates in a medium-sized company who doesn't want to be a prime, all the way to picking our prime and doing source selection. And then, I mean, it's going to constantly be the reality.
I would say, earlier this year, I was in a meeting at the Pentagon, and Lieutenant General Crawford was there, and Lieutenant General Fogarty, Lieutenant General Flynn walked in, Lieutenant General Berrier walked in, Lieutenant General Pasquarette walked in, Lieutenant General Ostrowski walked in. They talked for an hour, and no four-star told them to get together. Adam, you were there. And it was all about supply chain. Everybody had something to say. And I think this is just a topic that important to the Army, cross-cutting across the whole staff, the entire Army. It cannot not cross our industry partners in academia as well. And this is a problem, again, like privacy. We are in this together. And I think we look to industry and academia to support this effort, as General Crawford said, as a whole of nations approach, because it's a whole of nations issue.
I think I would add that if you have the right project or program or contract, they do come together. If a contract wants to develop something new and there's some research and development work that needs to be done, the right academic support along with the right industry companies working with the program manager, the requirements that are listed in the RFP, it can happen. The one thing that's becoming a bit of a problem, I think, is that when you look at this upswing in cyber and software development and security within the nation's universities, on the one hand, they are focusing more on cyber, they're focusing more on these hard problems, and they're starting to push out graduates who come with a starter set of skills that can support us. On the other hand, many of our universities are not just U.S. students. There's a lot of foreign students too, and so there's that mix there when you get into contract with an academic institution. You got to be a little bit careful, but I think the right contracts can do it as long as those types of tasks are built in to allow for that.
I want to pick up on one of Mr. Nucci's words. He said dynamic. And I think that's a really important thing to understand here, is that we can do all the risk assessment we want, but the problem is the threat vector changes continuously. So to go back to something Tim said, we used to deploy Windows as a gold master disk. It was something that we worked with Major General Barrett's NetCom team to develop. We've departed from that, and we use a process now called the secure host baseline with our team, where we rebuild this thing continuously. There's no such thing as the same threat yesterday that there was today. We have to continuously adapt to the threat, and the supply chain is no different. The risk and the threat is continuing to evolve, so the supply chain management methodology has to evolve.
Great, thanks. We're running out of airspeed and altitude here, but I do have a question here for Andy. Somebody wants to know, what are the key components to a successful insider threat program?
That's a complicated topic that I don't want to go too deep into. I mean, I think you start. Some of this is just is an extension of your normal security culture that you would have associated with managing a security clearance. Part of this is looking at the individual behaviors of the people and of your employees and your employee base, and when something occurs that indicates a risk, and that you have a way of capturing that and acting on that in a way consistent with your HR policies and with your legal policies, and understanding what that risk is. Part of this, a second part is a technical part where you are effectively monitoring your internal networks. Some of that is your basic practices that you would see in your Security Operations Center. But going beyond that in terms of watching your networks in a way that you're watching the internal workings of your networks versus defending it from external penetration. And I think that those two things coming together in terms of the technical ability within your operations to watch the internal behavior of your networks and the reporting pieces in terms of when something happens to an employee and their profile changes, and then being able to bring those two things together to monitor risk are probably the two biggest pieces without having a more extensive conversation. I see Microsoft nodding his head over there. You have anything to add?
Just in agreement, sir.
Yeah.
I would just add one piece. If we make the assumption, which could be correct in most cases, that every employee in a U.S. defense company is a U.S. citizen and bears faith and allegiance to what our country stands for, every single one of those employees is also a potential insider threat because of the actions they take on the network. Those that fall for a phishing attempt, those that get in and root around not knowing and screw something up on the system that leads to an outsider getting in. So I think training, cybersecurity training and anti-phishing kinds of activities I think are essential too, because all of us could potentially be the insider threat source for a major breach on whatever network we're on.
So before I give Adam a chance to close, I just wanted to, our Security Operations Center does phishing tests with us every so often, and it's always this email's coming from EXT, which means external, so don't click on it unless you know who it is, because the CSOC guys are going to come after you and say, well, you failed and now you've just infected the network, even though you haven't. Adam, with the time left, I'd like to give you the opportunity to make some closing comments.
Want to just sort of close with a couple of things that I heard that I think really resonated with me. And then I'm going to go back really quickly to the question about how we all can work better together. So I think we heard definitely several of the things that we also heard from General Nakasone and from General Fogarty about how much this is got a people dimension of it. That's really very important. One thing we didn't touch on is, and where I think that intersection between industry, academia, and the government really needs to become more tangible, is the balance between training and education. We have a couple of communities in our joint workforce that are really important to succeeding in this space. We can look at all the data we want. We can illuminate the supply chain down to the 7th tier sub and give it to the big data solution guys and have them heat map it and tell us all the risks. At the end of the day, what I've sort of learned as I've been talking to communities is there are engineering teams that are having a hard time translating from delivering uncompromised and doing the right thing for the soldier through to the characteristics of what you deliver. And they're putting together these teams of people who they need 15 purple unicorns, but it takes 27 people to figure it out. That's an area where academia and how we think about how we build those engineering teams and the process they execute has to change. Then we do all the right stuff and we get to the end. And our loggies and our supply clerks and the people who buy stuff and our third-party suppliers, they're not trained, they're not educated to think about how the simple act they're taking of buying something that goes into this system has some additional things they have to think about. How do we build those two communities differently on either end of the supply chain? Because guess what? All of us who are professionals and all of you who are professionals, we're working many of the other pieces of that. And I think those are some holes in our swing where if we work together to raise the bar on those sets of folks, I think we'd take a major bite out of this. Again, it's going to be a hard one. I will tell you that great comment about the capability maturity model. I think there's some positives for us about trying to think about how capable and mature we are to do this. I'll tell you the teams in the government that are working to set those policies are working really hard to do a couple things. One, not repeat the difficulties of implementing the RMF and make it worse. And two, keep the small guy in mind. So the government's really trying to work on both of those ends of it because we know that this could use up the entire national treasure solving. And the government doesn't want to do that any more than industry does. So with that, everybody, thank you so much for your attention and your questions. And with that, have a great afternoon.
Great. I'd like to thank the panel, and I'll note that we trained not only to time, but to standard.